Good morning, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us as we mark the 5-year anniversary since the terrible event that occurred here on October 27th, 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue that took 11 of our loved ones, very committed community members. And as we remember them on this day, we know that we all help to ensure that their memories are forever a blessing by carrying forward acts of service, study of Torah, and commitment to our communities. So thank you for being with us today to do just that. And today we are blessed to be joined by Rabbi Leo Dee. And in a second, I will introduce him and give a little bit more information about who he is and why he's come to join us today. I want to just go over some general housekeeping rules. We ask that you keep yourself on mute during the program unless you want to engage with the speaker at the end and ask him questions or make comments. If you're calling from a phone number, please put your video on now so we can see who you are. And in addition, if there are any members of the press who are joining us today, you are welcome to do so, but please know that the Torah session is off the record. Finally, please know that we do record this talk for the 1027 Healing Partnership, and the talk may be shared with people who were not able to be here this morning. I was in Jerusalem this Passover, and with my family, and we enjoyed our Passover together. And for the Dee family, it was the last Passover that they were to spend together, the last Seder, that they would join all along the table with their five children and mother. Because the day after Passover, we were horrified to learn that on a trip from Jerusalem to Tiberias, they were cut off by a terrorist, and the Dee family lost their beloved mother and 2 daughters. And I can speak for Beth and myself in that we were horrified to learn that this attack occurred, and certainly our sympathies were with the family in that difficult time, and we continue to think about their grief and during this year of Kaddish. But I really came to know Rabbi Dee and his family when I was a week later in Edgware, England, where I was at a shul where many of Rabbi Dee's friends were there, and they told me a little bit more about this gentle rabbi from their community. And the rabbi there encouraged all of us as a mandate from the Dee family that communities around the world study Pirkei Avot, as we study Pirkei Avot for the 6 Shabbatot between Pesach and Shavuot. And so I felt like this was a mandate to me to come home to my community, to remember the Dee family in this way. And not only did we begin to study Pirkei Avot for those 6 Shabbatot, but we actually spent so much time uncovering the 5 chapters of Pirkei Avot that we continued to study from Pesach all the way to Simchat Torah. And I can speak for myself that I got a great deal out of studying with the nearly 15 or 16 people who joined us weekly on Zoom and in person to study in depth the commentaries on the Pirkei Avot. So Rabbi Leo Dee now joins us from Israel for this Torah study today. And I just wanted to let people know that he was born in London, England. He studied at Yeshivat HaMivtar from 2004 to 2008. And in 2008, he became the assistant rabbi at Raleigh Close Synagogue in Hendon for United Synagogue, which is the organization of Orthodox synagogues in England. He served as rabbi there until 2011, and then he became the senior rabbi at Radlett, Hertforshire from 2011 to 2014. He holds a master's degree in engineering from Cambridge University and also a master's in public health from Hebrew University in 2016. And as I mentioned, Rabbi Dee is an articulate man who writes frequently about the Torah, and he has a special interest in environmentalism. He wrote a book called The Eco Bible that I have on my shelf, the Bible from an ecological standpoint. And he is well known for connecting parts of the Bible to the way that we can pay attention to environmentalism in our world. So without further ado, we welcome Rabbi Leo Dee.
Thank you, Rabbi Pullman. Thank you, Beth, for setting this up. And welcome to everybody. And thank you for inviting me today. Just to say that I started my life in a Reform community in West London Synagogue, which was the main Reform community at the time in England. And my rabbi was Rabbi Hugo Gryn. And I guess we're talking about dealing with grief. And Rabbi Gryn was an incredible man who you may have read about. He was a Holocaust survivor from Auschwitz. Came from an Orthodox family. And he told a number of stories which I imbibed in my youth and inspired me. And little did I know that I was going to be a survivor myself. And this will be very, all too pertinent. So just one or two ideas from Rabbi Gryn before we start. He said the following, which you may have also heard. I always quoted on Hanukkah, that his father would swap his bread rations for margarine before Hanukkah in the camps. And he said to his father one time, he said, "Father, how can you do that?" He said, "The bread it's going to give you life. And the margarine, he was going to burn it, a little bit of margarine each day of Hanukkah." And he said, "Son, a man can live 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, but not 3 moments without hope." And that was something which just struck me as being very pertinent and very helpful to me in my time of need. He also was asked, did he lose faith in God during the Holocaust? And he said, no, he lost faith in man, because the people who perpetrated it were apparently all PhD students from Heidelberg University, and he lost faith in secular academia, which I think many of us are losing faith in at the moment, including, thank God, many billionaires who are funding some of these institutions, and hopefully that will mean that they might change to become slightly more moral, but that's another discussion. So I'm talking about grief, but I think we have to talk about the current situation. I think, of course, we're remembering those 11 victims of the Pittsburgh massacre 5 years ago to the day. And the question is how to deal with trauma and grief. And I think there are two biblical, two characters in our tradition that give us two different models of how to deal with it. And one of them is Job. And I think our default is, when we look at the tragedy of Pittsburgh, and we look at the tragedy of the 7th of October, or I look at the tragedy that occurred to us 6 months before, exactly on the 7th of April, what one could be filled with terrible sorrow, disgust, fear, shock. And if I had 1,000-word thesaurus, I couldn't do justice to the feelings that we felt then, 2 weeks to 3 weeks ago, and the feelings that we continue to feel now when we see all the pictures about them, presumably when you remember what happened in Pittsburgh, and when I think about what happened to my wife and my daughters. And I think the biblical character who sums this up most is Job. Job is 42 chapters of philosophizing. He sits on his backside, if I can say that, at home with friends coming around and discussing, is Job good, is Job bad? Did he deserve it? Did he not deserve it? Is God good? Is God bad? Did he care about Job? Does he not care about Job? And every permutation of the above. And the argument goes backwards and forwards for about 42 chapters. And in the end, there doesn't seem to be any resolution. And we just thank God that God gives him some reasons to be happy, and the book can come to a rapid end. And I don't know too many rabbis who've studied Job in great detail, but I'm sorry if Rabbi Perlman is the exception. But because it really, it might be interesting, it's a bit of literature, but it's not that helpful in terms of how to deal with grief, in my opinion. In fact, the rabbis say it probably never happened. And if it did happen, Job probably wasn't Jewish. And I think that probably sums it up, that that's probably not the right Jewish response to tragedy. And then there's a second character we encounter in Jewish tradition who deals with tragedy in a very, very different way, and not at home. And that's Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, who lost 24,000 students between Pesach and Shavuot, so 7 weeks, probably during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, where he and his students took the side of Bar Kokhba. They were probably massacred by the Roman soldiers at the time. And there were 500 funerals a day, which is about a third of what we experienced on the Simchat Torah. But in any case, most people would say that Rabbi Akiva had every right to go into retirement, to become depressed, go into oblivion, and we would never hear from him again. But instead, he handpicks 5 students: Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi. I didn't say him already. And he trains them from scratch to become the rabbis of the Mishnah, which means that we still have our Torah today. So what type of man can do that? He lost probably every one of his friends, all his family, 24 years of his work that he invested in these students, and he picks up from scratch and he starts again. Another story about Rabbi Akiva: he's walking across the ruins of the Second Temple, and he laughs. And his friends say to him, "Why are you laughing?" And they say, and he says, because there are 2 prophecies. One was from Micah. He said that the Second Temple would be destroyed, and the second from Zechariah, who said that that the Third Temple would be rebuilt. And until I saw the temple destroyed, I didn't believe Zechariah that it would be rebuilt. Now I've seen it destroyed, I believe it will be rebuilt. So this was the greatest tragedy for Jewish people for 500 years, for half a millennium. And he laughs, and he sees the positive side of it. And then the third story we see by Rabbi Akiva is when he's dying. He's being killed by the Roman soldiers, who were the Hamas terrorists of their time. And he shouts out, "Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad." Hear, O God, the Lord, hear, O Israel, the Lord, our God, the Lord is one. And his students shout out something quite bizarre. They shout out, "That much?" Meaning to that extent. Now, we would normally say that Shema Yisrael is a statement of belief. I believe in one God. Right? That's how we were taught at Cheder, and that's what I was taught at Cheder. And in which case, why would his students, at the moment that he's about to die, and he shouts out Shema Yisrael, why would his students say to that extent? And Rabbi Akiva answers, yes, because you're meant to do it with all your soul. So even when God takes your soul, you're meant to say this. Because I would have thought that they said there's no atheist in a foxhole. So if you didn't believe in God your whole life, but you were dying and you were being put to death, you would suddenly believe in God, so you would say Shema Yisrael. So what would be even the thought process of his students to suggest that when Rabbi Akiva, who's this great rabbi who's gone through everything, wouldn't believe in God at his last moment? So it can't be that. So what's going on? So there's a Rashi on this verse in the Torah. In Deuteronomy 6, you'll find the verse of Shema Yisrael. And it's the least well-known Rashi in the Torah, and in my opinion, the most important Rashi in the Torah. And Rashi explains what Shema Yisrael means, and most rabbis ignore it. Shema Yisrael, according to Rashi, means as follows. Listen, hear, O Israel, the Lord who is our God today will be the one God of all the world in the future. In other words, the Shema Yisrael is not a statement of belief, right? You've been saying it twice a day for the last many years. it's not a statement of belief. According to Rashi, first and foremost, it's a statement that the mission of the Jewish people is to spread the knowledge of God on this planet. And therefore, what's going on is very clear in this story of Rabbi Akiva, because he shouts out, Shema Yisrael Nalehim Nachad, to the executioner, meaning your God, you Romans will follow our God in the future, which arguably, if they're Roman Catholic, possibly they do. Your God will be our God in the future. And his students shout out to this extent, meaning, do you really care what these people, these terrible people, do you care what happens to them? Let them go to hell. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, I want to fulfill the mitzvah of saying Shema, even with all my soul, meaning even if they're taking my soul, I still want to bless them that they will believe in my God. So anyway, in any case, we see that Rabbi Akiva is this tremendous optimist because he's being killed and he has this view of the future that things will change for the better. His students are being killed and he starts from scratch. And then he sees the greatest devastation of the Jewish people, which is the temple destruction, and he laughs. So how is he optimistic at this time? And I think if you think about it, it's obvious. Rabbi Akiva looks into the Torah and he sees that actually this is the pattern of the Jewish people. We have a tragedy and then God brings us redemption. We were slaves in Egypt for 80 years and God takes us out and he brings us to Mount Sinai in 7 weeks, and we get the Torah, which is the greatest book of anything. I mean, the greatest literature and book of life ever given. He probably, with Ruach HaKodesh, with ability to foresee the future, he might have seen that we were in Nazi death camps for 6 years, and 3 years later, we started the State of Israel. He might have seen it with his prophecy that after 6 days, where the whole world thought there would be a second Holocaust, everyone in Israel was going to be destroyed, and they dug tons of graves, that we recaptured the Kotel and the West Bank and all the historic sites of the Jewish people. So that's what happens. After a tragedy, God gives us some redemption. And here we are with this current tragedy, which is probably on the scale of certainly of the Yom Kippur War, probably of the War of Independence, maybe even of the Holocaust in terms of what it's where it's going at the moment. And we can only believe that Hashem is going to bring us a greater redemption. And if you look at the Amidah prayer, the Shemona Esrei prayer that we say in 3 times a day, the next thing that the Jews have on our wish list is building the temple. So maybe this is a step towards, or certainly it's a step towards building the third temple. And interesting enough, by the way, I saw an article, I don't know if you saw an Arutz Sheva on Channel 7, that apparently there's an Italian, the Italian minister of heritage is Jewish. And he told Rabbi Shmuel Eliyahu that he thinks now is the time for Italy to return the menorah that they have had for 2,000 years stored underground in Rome, and he admitted to it, along with a lot of the vessels from the Second Temple. And we know that they have them because if you look at the Arch of Titus, by the way, they're all carved into it, carrying these things away. And I've heard personally from people who visited the Pope over the last 20, 30 years that they've been told by the Pope that they are in storage somewhere in a vault. And this heritage minister apparently said to Rabbi Eliyahu, we think it's time to return it to you. So watch this space, but I think we're in very interesting times. And I think that one, even if that was not the case, one could see that this is a very unusual time because this whole tragedy happened on Simchat Torah. In Israel, it was Simchat Torah. At the time when we start reading from the Torah again, we finished Deuteronomy and we started Genesis. And actually, when in my shul, we had just read the first few chapters, the first couple of chapters of Genesis, when the first siren went off, we all had to run off into our bomb shelters. And how apt it is, because the story of the Torah starts with chaos. There was chaos, tohu v'bohu, which I think describes what was going on on the Gaza border at the time. And then Vayihi Or, then we know the first day that there will be light. And Sunday morning, which of course is when light presumably was created, the whole world woke up and there was a new light. And the light, according to our rabbis, was not the sunlight because the sun wasn't created. So therefore it was the light of truth. And apparently the world woke up to a new truth, which is that Israel is the good in this world. And we are affected by terrorists who are bad. And not only that, not just in Israel, but actually in every part of the world, there are good people and there are bad people. And bad people come out on the streets the day after a tragedy like that, supporting the terrorists. And good people apparently come out demanding that hostages are returned. And so therefore, bad people make it very easy for good people to identify who they are. So that's one of the features of light, that it shines on good and bad, and one can see truth. So that's interesting. Then, of course, we came to Pasha Noach, the next Pasha we had, which was last Shabbat, which was Pasha of Noah. And I think every rabbi in the world picked up on the fact that, the first few verses, it said that the world was full of Hamas, which is translated usually as violence. But actually, Onkelos, who was a convert, a Roman convert, who translates into the vernacular, which was Aramaic, and then is studied to this day as probably the most accurate translation of the Torah that there is, translates the word Hamas, interestingly, into Chatufim, which means kidnap. So basically, the Torah actually is saying the world was full of kidnapping. And that's why God decided to destroy it, which is interesting and frightening. The word Hamas appears elsewhere in the Torah, in a couple of places. One place meaning quite clearly violence, and a third place it talks about Eid Hamas. So it talks about a Hamas witness, which is clearly talking about a false witness, like a liar. So Hamas means three things in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew. Number one means violent. Number two means kidnapping. Number three means lying. And I think that basically sums up our enemy at the moment pretty accurately. Anyway, we're now on Parshat Lech Lecha, and this is interesting for a number of reasons. I think many rabbis might be talking about the fact that it deals with recovering hostages, this week's Parsha, if you notice, because Lot, which is Abraham's nephew, is kidnapped by some kings, and Abraham teams up. There's 4 kings and 5 kings. I never quite remember which team Abraham's on. Maybe Rabbi Pelman can help me. But anyway, there's 4 kings against 5 kings. There's like a world war, effectively. And Abraham sides with one group against the other group, and they recover the hostage, presumably hostages, which is Lot and his family. And I think there are a number of rabbis, Jews today, and all over the world who would hope that this is a good sign for the recovery of hostages this week. And one last idea, which I heard a couple of nights ago, I was speaking with Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg in a talk in Jerusalem, and I think he was the one who said this. He said that the Jews are described in this week's Pasha that they will become like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. So he said the stars in the sky, he said there are trillions of them, like so many that you can't count. He said, so it would be pointless to count the stars in the sky. He said, that is what a Jew does. A Jew aspires for the infinite, even though it doesn't seem possible. He just gets on and starts the job. And I think when you see the soldiers going to battle and you see the support they're getting, if we thought about the infinite amount of cooking and preparation that people would actually have to do, you might say, well, it's not even worth preparing one meal for these people, but people just are. And because they've started, they will finish. And these soldiers, thank God, are being very well looked after by everybody. So, so Jews embark upon impossible missions, and that's what they're doing. And then he says, like the sand on the seashore, and this was a new idea that I hadn't heard. He said, sand has a very unusual property. He said, if you heat it up to very, very high temperature, he said, it turns into glass. So something which is basically fluid, sand, which can pour through your hands, it's complete, has no strength whatsoever. If you put it under huge amounts of heat, it turns into glass, which is extremely, extremely strong, and can't even scratch it easily. It can last for thousands of years. So he said that's what Hamas didn't understand, is that they thought we were fractured as a society, but actually it turns out that we were not as fractured as they thought. Of course, when you put pressure on the Jewish people, we come together, we become very, very strong and invincible. So thank God that's what we're seeing now in Israel. In any case, so we see there's some hints to what's going on. Those of you who study prophets will have read in Amos chapter 1, verse 6 and 7, that Amos talks about a war in Gaza where they perpetrate 3 or 4 crimes. God doesn't forgive them. They kidnap, they take hostages, and their palaces are destroyed by fire, which I think is a pretty accurate explanation of what's going on. Rashi explains what are the 3 or 4 sins of the Gazans. He says the 3 cardinal sins, which are murder, idolatry, and sexual sin. I think we saw all of those, and I would say that when they shout Allah Akbar, their definition of Allah is the most idolatrous form of the greatest form of idolatry that there is, some sort of death cult. And when we hear Allah Akbar shouted at any of these type of situations, we know that they're not talking about God that we know of. They're talking about some sort of idolatry. And then the commentators say, well, what's the 4th sin? If the 3 sins are the 3 cardinal sins, what would be the 4th sin? And I think one of the commentators says it's something which is so obscene, it's like beyond even those 3. And I think the fact that they videoed these things, put it live on Facebook, sent it to the family members, some of the things that they did were so obscene that they were just beyond even most horrific sins that one could possibly imagine. So this has been predicted in Amos. I think we are definitely in biblical times. I'm veering off the topic now, but Israel's in its 75th year. By the way, Abraham was born in the Jewish year 1948, which might have connotations because that was the time of the establishment of the State of Israel. And this week's Parsha starts when he's 75 years old, which is the 75th year after 1948. So it would be 2023. And that's when the hostages are recovered. So interesting to look at these things. Nobody would have predicted it beforehand, but apparently God has a good sense of humor. Any case, well, okay, I'll continue. So Rabbi Akiva would have seen in Jewish history signs that tragedies are followed by redemption. But he would also see into nature, because the Netivot Shalom explains to us very nicely. He says, if you take a seed and you put it in the ground, he said, and you had a camera that could magically see underground, you would see that seed completely decomposing. It would like rot to pieces. You'd think it was dead and that there was no chance. And then suddenly, just before it disappears completely, the tiny kernel inside, which you've ignored up until this point, will suddenly turn green and then start sprouting, and out could come an oak tree that could last 1,000 years. So this is the way of nature. It's the way of the Jewish people. And it's an incredible feature that God put into creation, that somehow tragedy does lead into growth. And we say in our prayers, we say Bal Milchamot, Zoret Tzedakot, Ose Charashot, I think Ose Niflot, and Yeshuot, maybe Ose Yeshuot, I forget the exact terminology. Basically, we say that God is the creator of wars, and he's the one who brings salvation. And apparently, Rav Kook says there's a connection, that actually one of the ways that God brings salvation is through wars. And of course, we know that's true because we know that all the great inventions of our time came through wars. Right? The computer was invented during war. The internet was invented during war. We know the welfare state, I don't know what you call it in America, where you support people who can't work, that came after war. Votes for women came in England after the First World War, and so forth. So we see that social change and technological change happens rapidly after wars, and wars are a game changer effectively, and a terrible thing, but actually bring massive positive change historically, and that's what seems to happen. In any case, we see here that that something odd is going on, and we see that from tragedy comes growth. And the question is, how does one actually do that? Because in my family's tragedy, in your tragedy, in the families, the 700 families or so have been tragically bereaved over the last 3 weeks. How do you get there? And I had the benefit of some psychology sessions before I quit. And one of my psychologists, an excellent psychologist called Benny Lehman in Jerusalem, and he gave me the following idea. He said to me, Leo, he said, you're suffering two separate things which are happening parallel. He said, on the one hand, he said, you have more time. He said, you would have come home at night. You would have spent the time with your wife. You would have dinner with her. You would have had your 2 daughters on Shabbat. You might have called them during the week. And every time that you reach for the phone, every time that you come home to an empty table, empty bedroom, that's a reminder of what you've lost. And so it's the empty time and changing your schedule, changing your life. That is stressful and that is traumatic, and that's part of the trauma. And there's a second type of trauma, which is happening parallel, which is not necessarily the same thing, which is that when you just think about them, you think about what you've lost and maybe where they would be today and what they'd be doing. And when you think about them, that also will fill you with sorrow. And I realized at that point that I'd been quite lucky in a sense that, thank God, we had many people came to the Shiva. And after the Shiva, people contacted me by WhatsApp and asked me to do this and do that, speak here, speak there, be involved in this project and that project. So I decided very quickly, I quit my job as a teacher, and it was fine. The kids were it was only a couple of months before the end of term, and they were fine. I just did whatever people asked me to do. And I filled up my diary with many interesting, challenging things. And I found that they fitted into 3 categories. One, which linked very closely to Lucy, which was really her personality was about building community. And one with Maya, which was really about teaching Torah and learning Torah. And one with Rena, which was really about peace. She was into peace activism and so forth. So, all the things I did linked into one of those 3 categories. And it's solved, I don't know if it's solved, but it helped me on both of these fronts. Number one, I found I didn't have so much time to sit there like Job and worry about why things had happened to me and why I was sad and how sad I was and whether God was good, etc. But in fact, I was quite busy and therefore doing things that I enjoyed. And therefore, I was jumping out of bed and I was finishing my day at 11 o'clock at night and exhausted and went to sleep. And that was tremendously therapeutic. And then the second thing, which was thinking about the girls, it took much longer. But when I started thinking about the girls, I would cry. And now when I think about them, I actually think about them in much more positive terms. And when I do these projects, I'm thinking about them all the time, but in a positive light. I'm thinking they've inspired me to do what I'm doing. So I think that actually being active, doing things that are meaningful to you when you have a tragedy is a tremendous therapy. And therefore, I think that the solution for us, maybe it's 3 years, 5 years later for Pittsburgh, people already hopefully are repair, are healing. But I think for those of us who are still, suffering from what happened 3 weeks ago, I think there is a very strong message here, which is we need to be active, and we need to be active in 3 ways. The Ethics of the Fathers teaches us that the Jewish world stands on 3 platforms: Torah, prayer, and action. Right, Torah Avoda and Commemorative Torah Study, which is Torah learning, prayer, and action. So Torah learning. I know that you had Rabbi Sachs speak. He was one of my teachers and inspirations for many years in England, and he says on Parshat Chayei Sarah, right, which is the last parsha of Abraham's life. And Abraham enters that parsha, that story, at the age of 130. And he tells us that it's a tragedy because Abraham has been promised 3 things by God. Number 1, that he will inherit the whole land of Israel. Number 2, that he will have offspring that will be like the stars in the sky, in this week's parsha. And number 3, that he'll be the father of many nations, also in this week's parsha, actually. So he's got 3 promises in this week's parsha. And he arrives 5 parshas later, and he has none of them, and he's 130 years old. He doesn't have 1 square millimeter of the land of Israel. His son isn't married, and he has no connection whatsoever with any other religion. Says Rabbi Sachs, what's he do in the last parsha of his life? He sets about to fulfill what God has promised him. So he buys the Cave of Patriarchs in Hebron, which we know we still have, which is the first purchase of a Jew of land in Israel. Number 2, which incidentally means that it's the most genuine part of Israel. I know for those people who think politically it might be problematic to be in the West Bank, where I live, it actually is the first part that was ever bought, and it's documented in the Bible, which is apparently agreed to by Christians and Muslims. So therefore, there's absolutely no reason to doubt that Tel Aviv perhaps has less of a good story to it. It was the land of the Philistines. So just putting things in perspective. Anyway, the first piece of land was bought by Abraham at the beginning of that parsha. Then he sends off his slave servant Eliezer to find a wife for Isaac. He finds Rebecca, and then he's sorted on that front. And number 3, he gets remarried right at the end of the parsha. Most people don't remember this bit, to a woman called Keturah. They have 6 sons. They name them by Indian names, send them off to the east, that Rashi says is India, with gifts that some rabbis say is the Kabbalah, is the Jewish mysticism. And they establish Eastern religions, including Hinduism, Buddhism. And by the way, the main god of Hindus is Braham. Brahamism, Abraham, Braham. So apparently he was successful. And obviously we know today that Christians and Muslims also trace their way back to Abraham. So pretty much the vast majority of people on this planet apparently can. So he fulfills that as well. What's the point? The point is that when Abraham is in a crisis, he thinks about what God promised him, and then, or what I asked him to do, and then he does it. And when I was in a crisis and my family were in a crisis, what did we do? We basically thought about what would the Torah demand of us, and we grabbed onto that. And it helped that we'd studied quite a lot about emunah, about Jewish belief, faith, and Torah, and so forth. All these things helped us through our crisis. And anyone who has a crisis, and a Jew has a crisis, the Torah which you've learned is what will help you through that crisis. So that, I think that's one thing. Studying Torah is very helpful in a crisis. Number 2, prayer. We need to pray for the hostages. We need to pray for the soldiers, Jewish soldiers, to come back. Why do we pray? Because if God has made up his mind, what does it make that I, Chaim Cohen, tell God that he's wrong, right? I mean, God apparently knows better than I do, so what's the point of me telling him? And if he's made up his mind, he's going to do it anyway. So Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg from Florida explains as follows, a beautiful idea. He says that he told a story about 2-3 years ago that there was a guy in Florida who won $150 million on the lottery. Well, he won it, and it was in the paper every day for 6 weeks with the ticket number and the place that he bought it, a little shop in Florida, and they knew what time he'd come in and what day it was, and they publicized it, and nobody came to collect the prize. So and then, of course, the money went back into the pot and was recycled for another draw. And Rabbi Ephraim said at the time, he said, this is a beautiful model for prayer. He said, God has got $150 million waiting for each and every one of us, and all we have to do is bring the ticket. All we have to do is bring the ticket. In other words, that God is going to bring back the hostages and the soldiers, but subject to us asking for it. He intends to do it, but he wants the whole Jewish people to come and to pray. And if we come and we pray all together in our synagogues, then he will give us what we are praying for, because that's what he would like to do. But he expects us to come and ask him for it. So that is prayer, and that takes maybe a couple of hours a day, whatever. What is the greatest thing that we can do in time of crisis? And this is the big thing. And I'm recruiting you, by the way, I didn't expect this, to the Israeli army. This war is being fought on 2 fronts. The brave Israeli soldiers are fighting on 2 fronts at least, but there's a second front, which is the front of media. And as you've noticed, that it's very important for Israel to win that battle, because if we continue to explain to the world why this is existential and why this isn't just like any other war, this is actually a battle of good against evil, and that we've seen the greatest evil that I think the planet has ever experienced. You can't call these people animals, because there are no animals that behave in the way that those terrorists behaved on the 7th of October. And therefore, we are extinguishing something in humanity which is inhumane, which is not part of humanity. It's not part of nature. It's not part of the animal world, and it's certainly not part of the plant world. It's something which is so. I think Christians have better ways of explaining these things than we do. They have Antichrist and they have Satan. But we don't have words in English. We don't have words in Hebrew to explain how evil what we saw was, and whatever it is very dangerous and like a virus can spread, as we've seen in America, Europe, and therefore has to be extinguished completely. Otherwise, it will spread like a virus, and the world could get destroyed. So Israel is fighting this battle not just for Israel; it's fighting it for the, I think, existential battle for the whole world. And we know that Iran has nuclear weapons, so therefore, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that people this evil, backed by people that evil, could actually do evil, which is even greater than the evil that we've experienced 3 weeks ago. So we need to win this war of the media. Every single one of you, I assume, consumes a lot of media, have seen a lot of videos, have seen a lot of social media, television even. Every one of us is responsible for creating media as well as consuming it. Anyone who consumes media is capable of creating media. You know what the messages should be. You know what you need to say. And obviously the more messages, the better, because nobody knows which messages are going to work. And we're messaging to Christians, to Muslims, to Jews, to the whole world in order to explain what's going on. I've spoken to a lot of media, and they're interested in this story, obviously, because it's a huge story. But they're baffled. They don't understand why this battle is any different to any other battle. Every other battle, you look at the number of civilian casualties on this side, you look on that side, and when it gets higher on that side, they're winning and we have to stop, and that's what happens. This is not that type of war. We know that. Most of us know that. And therefore, we have to explain why that is not that type of war. This is a war where you have to get rid of every single grain of evil. And also, all the civilian deaths on the Palestinian side are completely caused by Hamas, who started this war with the intention of causing civilian death. So whatever. So it's a complex story, but the messages are very important. You know the messages that you would like to communicate, and Israel needs you to help. So you've now been appointed as foot soldiers, some of you captains, maybe some of you generals in the media war, and you're expected to produce at least one item a week, ideally more, going on the next few weeks to keep the dialogue going. And it's a massive brainstorming session, effectively, between Jews across the world and non-Jews. Plenty of wonderful Christians and Muslims who are involved in this discussion, and Indians. Lots of people are participating from many different walks of life. People understand this is an existential threat, not just to Israel, but to them. And people want to participate in order to explain to the world why that should be. So if we, so I'll just come to the end of this, then I'll take questions. If we're dealing with the trauma of what happened 3 weeks ago, and we want to get through it, if we take a project upon ourselves, such as creating this media, or raising charity for Israeli charities that need it, or any other type of project that packing boxes and sending it off to Israel, doing a mission to Israel, many different things that you could do. If we do that, we will solve two problems that we have. Number one, we have too much time sitting at home, worrying about the situation, philosophizing, listening to other people's messages about it, and the media complaining about how they're reporting it. But if we are creating our own media, then we will have less time to listen to other people's, and more chance of our messages coming across. That's number one. Number two, when we think of the destruction of those 1,400 people, not to mention the 250 hostages, not to mention the soldiers, and so forth, and the terrible devastation that's occurred here in the Jewish people, I think if we are active doing positive things from this, we will feel that their memory is a blessing to us, because they've inspired us to do important work, which is important education for us and for the whole of society in the world. And therefore, we won't feel quite as sad. We'll feel more inspired by the sacrifice of these holy lives. So that's I guess my greatest advice to anyone overcoming grief: be busy. And be busy. And if you're busy doing meaningful things, that's probably the healthiest way to deal with grief. I'm happy to take a couple of questions, and I know you want to say Kaddish. Any questions? If you want to unmute yourself or send something through the chat, you're welcome to type something in the chat, and I will answer you there.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Dee, for that beautiful and meaningful presentation. It really gave us a lot of hope. I'm just wondering if you'd spend a moment or two and tell us a little bit more about Lucy, Maya, and Rena, and why each of them did the things that you mentioned that you do in their honor, and how something specific about them and how they inspire you, and maybe the Peer Kavod Project, because not everybody here is familiar with it.
Okay, so Lucy was a community builder, as I said. She when we lived in, before I became rabbi, I was working in finance, and we lived in a community, a large community in London. And she invited a load of young couples. This was an older community where a lot of young couples had moved in quite recently. And we invited a lot of them for Shabbat. And she would always invite at least 2 couples to us. There were like 6 of us around the table. And what we found was the community grew around, and she started a committee in the end, which was called Kavarim. And when we came back 5 years later, after we'd been to Israel, studied in Israel, they'd started a whole minyan, basically a whole new community around what she'd done. And I didn't fully understand why that was until I read the Maharal. The Maharal asked the question, why is it when we bench, if there are more than 3 men present, you say a mazuman, which is like, you say Rabbatai Varech, right? You say a special, but why 3? And he explains it. He draws a triangle in his explanation, because he doesn't know the Hebrew word for a triangle, apparently. And he says a triangle is the smallest shape that you can draw. It's the smallest number of points that connect together to make a shape. That's his explanation. So what does he mean? I think I fully understood what he meant. He means that if you invite one couple to your Shabbat meal, then you'll build like a line between the 2 of you, a great connection between the 2 of you. But if you invite 2 couples to your Shabbat meal, then not only will you build a connection with each of them, but they'll build a connection between themselves. And this is what we found, is that then the couples would often invite each other and somebody else to the next Shabbos meal, and so forth and so on. So actually what you've done is you start a chain of action, of good. And when you invite one person, that's not a chain. That's just like building up one relationship. But when you invite 2, you actually start a chain which could go off and become almost sort of, exponential. So that's what Lucy understood and continued doing when we were rabbi in Rebbetzin in 2 communities in London. And I think that really had an impact. She was really the main thing, and I was just the guy who said a few words, but she was the community leader in both those communities. So that was a bit about Lucy. A second about Maya. Maya loved Torah. She studied in SEM the year before this happened. The year that this happened, she was actually helping out in a high school in Yerucham, where she was teaching. She was helping the teachers with year 9 girls, and she started something called Nishnosh Parsh, which means in Hebrew snack and parsha. And the portion of the week. So she would buy, I think with her own money, snacks. She would invite the girls to come on a Thursday break time for 5-10 minutes to sit around and chat and eat together. And she would give a little discussion about that week's parsha. And that's something which apparently they now do in many schools around Israel in her name. And the Pirkei Avot came about because we invited a couple of friends of hers from England who she hadn't seen for about 6 years. 9 years, and they happened to be in SEM themselves, and so they came to our Shabbat table. At the time, we were going around the table discussing Pirkei Avot, so we were one by one, and I was asking questions, and everyone was discussing them, and that was one Shabbat. And then these 2 girls, when this happened, wanted to do a project to remember Maya, and so they started this Pirkei Avot project, and they literally started publishing, each week a different Mishnah. and the comments and questions on it, and it just went viral, thank God. And tens of thousands of Jews around the world are learning Pirkei Avot because of them, because of Maya, because whatever. So that's amazing. And Rina, I'll tell you, she went to a school in Hebron, near Hebron, in Kiryat Arba, which is very right wing. Although I think now in Israel everybody's very right wing, so I'm not sure these classifications count anymore. And often at the Shabbat table, I would argue pro-Palestinian, and she would argue anti the Palestinians. And that was the sort of discussion we'd have. She'd heard a lot of things from her friends. I assume she'd heard from her friends a lot of ideas which were sort of not very right wing, and I would argue with her. When this all happened, a few weeks after the Shiva, we invited some of her friends for a Shabbat meal, and I asked them, to tell me things that were unusual about Rina that made her different from other girls. And one of them said she was unusual in the school in Kiryat Arba because she was the one who stood up for the Palestinians. So I was like shocked because I thought she was the one who was like really right wing. Turns out that she was arguing with me at the Shabbat table to find out all the arguments so she could then give them to her friends when she went back to school, but she never told me that. So that was Rina. So I've been involved in quite a few discussions about peace talks and so forth. I'm still right wing and I'm still, a settler, but the solution to the current crisis and any crisis will come from right wing settlers in my mind. So, okay. Any other questions, or you're welcome to go on to Kaddish.
Perhaps in the interest of time, because we're running short and we have other Torah study, we'll conclude. Rabbi Dee, thank you so much. I'm Brian Schreiber. I'm the emeritus CEO of the JCC of Greater Pittsburgh and the current Chief External Affairs Officer. And it's been wonderful to study. It's a challenging day here in Pittsburgh, but we renew and we reflect and we study Torah, and obviously we take part of the time-honored tradition of the Kaddish D'Rabbanan. We do that in the memory of the 11 individuals that were taken from us, and I'm going to read their names, which is transliterated, so it's weird for me to look at it without the Hebrew words, so I'll try to get this correct. Joyce Feinberg, Edith Balcha bat Abba Menachem, Richard Gottfried, Yosef Ben Chaim, Rose Malinger, Razel bat Avraham, Jerry Rabinowitz, Yehuda ben Yeheskel Beselma, Cecil Rosenthal, Cecil Chaim ben Eliezer, David Rosenthal, David ben Eliezer, Bernice Simon, Bela Rachel bat Moshe, Sylvan Simon, Zalman Shachna ben Menachem Mendel, Daniel Stein, Daniel Avraham ben Baruch, Melvin Wax, Moshe Gadol ben Yosef, and Irving Younger, Yitzhak Chaim ben Menachem. Zichronam livracha, may their memories together be a blessing. I'm going to ask everybody, which is customary, to rise, and we will do the Kaddish D'Rabbanan together. Yitgadal v'yitgadash merabah, v'yamad divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, v'agala v'zman kariv v'yimru amen, Yehei shmei rabah mevarach le'olam l'olei amaya, Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitramam v'yitnasei, v'yitadar v'yitalei v'yitalal shmei d'kudeshav b'rechu, le'elam min kol birchata b'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, Daviram v'alma v'yimru amen. Al Yisrael v'arav anan v'al tamidehon, v'al kol tamidei tamidehon, v'al kol man da'askim bo'oraita, Divartad Hadein B'di B'chol Atar V'Atar, Yehelahon Ochon Shlama Rabba, China B'chista B'Rachamin, B'chayin Arichin, Umzana B'Richa, B'Rchokana, Mikadam Abuhon Diva Shemaya V'imru Amen. Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya, B'chayim Tovim Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. Osei Shalom B'Imromav, Hu B'Rachamav, Yasei Shalom, Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael. Amen. Thank you all for participating in study. Thank you, Rabbi Perlman and Beth, for your participation and working to bring Rabbi Dee to us. And Rabbi Dee, thank you in this very, very difficult time in Israel for making time to learn and study with us and enlighten us with Torah. Shabbat Shalom to you in Israel, and Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for having me.